All right, imagine you're living in the 1930s. No TikTok, no DoorDash, no Wi-Fi, already a nightmare. But now imagine you have a disability. Maybe a mental disability, maybe a physical one. What happens to you?
Oh no, I already don't like where this is going.
Yeah, because back then, if you had any kind of mental disability, society didn't care about you. Like, at all. They saw you as a burden. Your family might have sent you to an institution. The government, they weren't out here passing disability rights laws. Instead, people with disabilities got locked up in places that were supposed to help them, but really, it was just a way to keep them out of sight.
So basically, the 1930s had out of sight, out of mind energy, except it was people's actual lives they were ignoring.
Not just ignoring, mistreating. These institutions? Horrible. Like, we're talking people getting tied to beds, shock therapy, lobotomies.
Okay, pause. Lobotomies. You're telling me that back then, the solution to this person is struggling was, let's just remove part of their brain.
Yep, and the absolutely most bonkers part? Doctors actually thought it was helping. They believed that if they took out a chunk of someone's frontal lobe, they'd be calmer or easier to manage. Meanwhile, people were getting turned into zombies. No personality, no emotions, just blank.
This is literally a horror movie, like, oh, your anxiety is bad. Don't worry, we'll just take out part of your brain real quick, no big deal. No, absolutely not.
And this wasn't just random shady doctors. The dude who made lobotomies won a Nobel Prize. I need everyone to really sit with that. This man literally had a great job. Moment for inventing a procedure that ruined people's lives. That's like if they gave an Oscar to the guy who invented unskippable YouTube ads.
And if being locked away wasn't bad enough, some states didn't even let people with disabilities have kids. They literally passed laws forcing sterilization because they thought disabilities were bad for society. And the government was totally on board. The Supreme Court was like, yeah, that's fine. And people lost their rights overnight.
Wait, time out. You're telling me people could literally be forced to get surgery so they couldn't have kids because the government decided they weren't good enough to be parents?
Yep. Buck v. Bell, 1927, Supreme Court basically said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And that was the law. People lost their rights just like that.
Okay, I officially hate everything about this.
Let's use this as a transition to talk about John Steinbeck and the power of storytelling.
Okay, this is depressing. But I don't hate John Steinbeck. This is where he comes in, right?
Exactly. He saw this stuff firsthand. He grew up in California, and he saw how society treated people who were poor, different, or struggling. That's why he wrote books like Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath. He wanted to show the reality of how people lived. Not the American dream fantasy, but the actual struggle.
So basically, Steinbeck was out here doing exposés before exposés were a thing.
And in Of Mice and Men, he gave us Lenny. He's a big, strong guy, but he has a mental disability, and because of that, nobody takes him seriously. People treat him like he's a problem instead of a person.
And Steinbeck wasn't just guessing. He literally went out and lived among migrant workers. He saw the conditions firsthand, talked to families, and wrote about it in his newspaper articles before turning it into a novel. So when he wrote Of Mice and Men, he wasn't just making a sad story, he was telling the truth about how society treats people it doesn't think fit in.
So basically, Steinbeck said, hey, let's all be better humans. And people were like, nah, we're good.
Dude, who gets left behind? Hear me out, okay? Because this actually reminds me of something. Y'all ever been in a group project?
Oh no, where is this going?
Listen, group projects. The biggest social experiment in who gets left behind. You got the one kid who does everything, the one who's just there for the grade, the one who never shows up, and then the one people don't even tell about the meeting. Like, oh, Jake, we didn't invite him, he doesn't really contribute. That's what society was doing to people back then. If you didn't fit their mold, you got left out of the project, no chances, no let's help you succeed. Just, oh well. And the worst part? People who didn't fit got blamed for not contributing enough, even though the system was the real problem.
Wait, that's actually such a good analogy. Society was running group projects but refusing to give some people the chance to even try.
And it still happens. It's not as obvious, but we still see it. People with disabilities, they still face discrimination at work, in schools, in healthcare. And mental health, that's a whole other fight. Alright, so we've talked about how society treated people with disabilities back in the 1930s, but let's get real. How does media treat them today?
Oof. Okay, this is a conversation. Because yeah, we don't have movies and books straight up saying people with disabilities are useless anymore, but the way they're portrayed, still kind of a mess.
Right? Like, have y'all noticed that every movie with a disabled character is either inspirational or just straight up tragic? It's either, wow, look at them overcoming all odds, or wow, so sad, what a burden. Like, maybe just let people exist?
Exactly. And then there's the whole thing where they barely even get to be the main character. Most of the time, they're just side characters in someone else's story, like the best friend who gives motivational speeches but has no life of their own.
And let's talk about who plays these roles. Because if Hollywood can cast someone to play a superhero with actual powers, they could definitely cast actors with real disabilities instead of just hiring able-bodied actors to act disabled.
Yes, like we are out here using CGI to make dragons look realistic, but apparently finding an actual disabled actor is too hard. Make it make sense.
And this is why Of Mice and Men still matters. Because who gets to tell these stories? Who gets to be represented? The whole reason Steinbeck's book hit so hard is because he actually told the truth about how society treats people who are different. But we're still seeing people with disabilities get pushed to the side, even in the stories that are supposed to be about them.
So yeah, we've come a long way from let's lock people up and erase them from society, but the fight for actual, respectful representation, still happening. And honestly, we need more Steinbecks out here, making people pay attention. Okay, so let's look at the final takeaways, then versus now.
And even today, mental health care is still a privilege, not a right. A lot of schools barely have counsellors, workplaces discriminate against people with disabilities, and let's not even start on how many people with mental illness end up in prison instead of getting actual help. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go.
The good news? We have come a long way. Like, people actually talk about mental health now. Therapy isn't some secret thing. There are laws protecting people with disabilities. We have schools and jobs making sure people get fair treatment. But we're not all the way there yet.
And social media? Double-edged sword. On one hand, it's helping people talk about mental health, find support, learn things. But on the other hand, we've got people self-diagnosing off TikTok like, oh my gosh, I lose my keys sometimes. I definitely have memory loss. Or, I got sad last week, I must be clinically depressed. Like, no. Mental health is real, it's not a personality trait.
And that's where Of Mice and Men still matters today. It makes you stop and think about how we treat people, how we look at people who are struggling, and whether we actually help them or just push them aside.
Yep, and 90 years later, we're still having the same conversations. Who gets included, who gets left behind, and what are we going to do about it?